Alright, so let's begin. So today, students, we're going to be talking about something related to this, but not exactly this. I know it's a little bit misleading, but we're going to have a fun lesson today. And with this video, you guys are going to be given kind of a hint on what we're going to be doing this morning. So, clicking on it, I already have it preloaded.
You're so smart.
Access to light is the great problem here. Those plants that can command the surface can rule the land. None does so on a greater scale and more aggressively than this, the giant Amazon water lily. Its gigantic leaves are armored with spines that protect them against any fish that might try to make a meal of them. Their huge expanse is kept outstretched and floating on the surface by a lattice of buoyant air-filled struts. The crinkles in the surface swiftly flatten out as the leaf expands to its full size. The edges are turned up so that the leaf can shoulder aside any competition. Fully grown, a single leaf is 6 feet across. Virtually no other plants can live in the black shaded water beneath these leaves. They cover the surface so completely, and the support of their air-filled girders is so effective, that birds, most famously the lily trotter, can spend their entire lives walking around collecting insects. The giant lily's flowers are on an equally monumental scale. They're about a foot across. The life of any one bloom is short. It opens in the evening and gives off a strong perfume. During the night, it closes, and it stays closed for the whole of the next day, slowly flushing pink. On its second evening, it opens again. Then it closes for the last time. Why does it behave in this extraordinary way? It's a neat way of avoiding any chance of being fertilized by its own pollen. The perfume it produces on its first evening attracts beetles. They bring with them pollen from other lilies, so this flower is about to be fertilized. Then the lily closes its petals. The beetles will be held captive inside for 24 hours. The following evening, the beautiful prison opens its gates and inmates are free to go.
Should all have like stripes on them. Or stripe needles.
The flower has showered the beetles with its own pollen during their long stay. Now red and odorless, the flower is no longer attractive to beetles, so they'll go in search of white flowers on another plant, carrying the pollen and bringing about cross-fertilization. Its mission completed, the flower withdraws back to its watering world.
There we go. On that note, that's our lovely David Attenborough giving us a a really perfect example of sexual reproduction with plants. So, now we're going to start our lesson. So to begin with, we have the life cycle of a seed plant. With this, we start off with a seed, and then it starts growing and becomes a seedling. And as it develops and continues to grow, it will eventually form reproductive structures. And that's basically when the plant becomes an adult. And then from there, pollination occurs again, and then you get seeds. So just over there in the bottom left, that's the whole little cycle there. You might want to take note of that, kids. So we're going to go on to the next one. All right, so stages of the seed. Oh, three main parts of the seed. So for this, we have the embryo, which is a component of the embryonic leaves, cotyledon, and the primary root. Those are all kind of like the initial stages of baby plant. Then we have the endosperm, which is pretty much a storage vessel for nutrients, and the plant will use that when it begins to grow under the right conditions. So the seedling stage, as mentioned before, grows very fast. For instance, bamboo shoots, those grow extremely fast, very fast rate. Produce their own food through photosynthesis, as we covered in the lesson just before this, and nutrients from the soil that they also need as well to grow and get strong. The adult stage, so, produces reproductive structures such as flowers and cones, as seen on pine trees or dandelions, for instance, out there in the field. You know, we just love those dandelions, especially the rabbits. So next we have the reproduction of seed plants, and this is done via pollination. So you're going to have, for instance, your male component of the flower and your female component of the flower. They can be either together as one or separate in different plants. And then from there, they get pollinated in different methods. So I'm going to show you guys a little bit of that in a bit. But first we've got to get to the different structures of the male and the female plants. So for the male plant, we have pollen. There are various different structures of pollen. They are very interesting. I suggest you guys look them up online. They're really fascinating to look at. They're small, sticky. They are really good at binding to things. I don't know if you've ever run through a field of goldenrod, things like that. You get a ton of pollen on you. And they produce millions and millions of pollen grains. And they're also distributed in other fashions, which we will get to very shortly as well. And there's a nice picture of some anthers right here, which house pollen granules. So the female part, unfortunately this diagram is both the male and female, but you can just do a quick summary on this as well. So this is something important to be writing down in your notes, because we could have a quiz on this. So the female part is basically called the ovary. It's right down there it's the section that contains the ovule. So as you can see there, the ovule is in the middle, and the ovary is actually that section. And then another important part is the stigma, which is the top section of the style, which is, this whole section is called the pistil. That is the female component, and then again for review, we have the anther for the male component, and then the filament, which goes down, which all come together to form the stamen. And then we all know the petals and sepals from before. So continuing on. So pollination, let me go over this process. First step, it occurs after a pollen grain lands on top of the stigma, as we just saw on the previous slide, just above the ovary. And then from there it forms a pollen tube, which goes all the way down towards the ovule inside of the ovary. From there, genetic information is exchanged, and then we have a seed that is formed. So I'm going to switch it over to here just to illustrate. So we have our nice, very basic drawing of the male and the female flower. So from there, the pollen is transferred from the anther over onto the stigma on the top, and then from there, the pollen tube goes down and fertilizes the ovule, and then you get the production of a seed. So cones are also another example of a reproductive structure. So we have the male and the female cones. I believe the male ones are at the bottom, if I remember correctly. The females are at the top. So with conifers, for instance, they can be separate or on the same tree depending on the species. The male ones obviously produce the pollen, and the female obviously produces the eggs, the ovules. So, many plants, such as conifers and grasses, can actually be pollinated by wind. I have a nice little quick video for you guys about that. Get to it. There we go.
Most people would readily agree that this is a flower. Some people may not think that this is a flower, though, because it doesn't have brightly colored petals and a strong fragrance and so on. However, grasses are true flowering plants. Flowers like these have beautiful conspicuous flowers, mainly to attract the insects or other animals that pollinate them. They use a lot of precious resources to produce bright petals, smells, nectar, and so on. Grasses have a different strategy. They transport their pollen from plant to plant on our nearly constant summer breezes. On Wyoming's arid plains and sagebrush steppes, it makes sense to use the wind to distribute pollen and to use precious water and nutrients for other kinds of production. Yet, grasses, which are indeed flowers, learned thousands of years ago to use one of Wyoming's cheapest and most abundant energy sources, the wind, to propagate themselves. There
we go. Back on track. So pollinators, that's another process by which plants can reproduce or spread their pollen from plant to plant. For there, we can have animals, insects, even sometimes other things like humans as well can do that as well. It's very, very expensive though to hire a whole bunch of humans to pollinate tons of flowers, but it has been done. So for instance, we have dragonflies up here, bees, hummingbirds, and butterflies, lovely butterflies. So, as explained before with pollen transfer, so you have your one flower, you have an organism that lands on it, grabs the pollen, gets stuck on its body because remember it's sticky, and then from there the insect or the animal goes off to another plant, and from there that pollen gets put onto the stigma of the other plant, and then from there you have a seed production that happens. So that's how plants get their genetic material around. And then as said before, you can have it done by bees or even by humans. Mind you, bees not actually physically pollinating each plant. But, farmers have developed actual ways to ensure pollination happens. And that makes a big difference on crops as well, having bees nearby. So, reproduction without seeds is the fun part, vegetative reproduction. So basically there aren't seeds produced in this method of reproduction, and they're genetically identical. So, we'll go over some examples. So for instance, if you have a tomato garden at home, you might have seen your parents or grandparents maybe copy their tomato plants and give it to their neighbors. So, for instance, tomatoes, they produce runners, which are long stems that just grow above the ground, and from there can produce a new plant, which is pretty interesting, and lots of new tomatoes. So you also have rhizomes, so plants that form underground stems and produce new plants. I have a great example of this, a trumpet plant that my parents have at their house, and it's the biggest pain in the butt to try and keep it in one location because it continuously tries to shoot stems out of the ground and you're forever trimming it constantly and constantly. But it smells really pretty and it's a beautiful plant. You also have bulbs, tubers, and corms, also structures that are formed underground. You can reproduce plants out of that if you've ever taken a carrot, just the carrot part, not the actual leaves. You can put that in the ground and actually develop roots and continue to grow a new plant, which is kind of interesting. And then we have suckers, which are produced from the roots of the parent plant, so you can snip off a section of root from your favorite plant at home and try and see if it grows just by itself in a container, but you gotta make sure you let your parents know before you start cutting all the roots off your plants in your house. So, before we move on to technologies, I'm just going to go over a quick review because I know we went over that kind of quick. So, just to reiterate so that we all know what's going on. So these guys here, this is your stem. Obviously this is the ground. And then through here, that is your runner, which is basically an extension of the stem that keeps growing and new plants can develop from that. And here we have the rhizomes. So you can have the tubular sort of, or bulbous type of structures. And then you can also have offshoots from the stem, and those pop up as well to form a new plant. And then lastly, you have the suckers, which come from the roots actually, and can form a new plant. So cut off the root, one plant, and then it will begin to grow a new plant out of the root. That's drawn there, but we get the picture. So technologies to reproduce plants, you have cuttings. So you cut a piece from a plant and you can use it to reproduce that plant. So cuttings usually have part of the stem and then some leaves on there because you need that section to be able to photosynthesize and gain the nutrients it needs as well. Then we have grafting, where it involves basically sectioning off a plant, part of it, and then attaching it to another. You see that very frequently with specific trees. I know they do it with apple trees now and again. It's very interesting seeing different types of apples being produced off of one tree. All right. So, with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start our nice little activity. So I got some paper over here. Hopefully everyone has a writing utensil for this. So I'm going to pass around some paper and we're going to have some fun and design a plant. Here we go. Just somewhere you can spot. So as we've been going through this lecture, that's a lot of information to take in. That's why it's good to visualize it and then in your head and then draw it down. Help us remember. So, for this activity, I want to make sure you guys create your own plant. Yeah, I can't remember the movie that's based off of.
Of course.
There you go. Yep. Classic. You should probably watch that at some point. So, for this activity, you want to make sure that you answer these questions. So, specifically, I really want to see the structures that we talked about on your diagram. Mind you, you can make it a vegetative reproduction for your plant. You don't have to give it a flower. You can do a cone. You can give it some strange sort of shaped bulb. You have a lot of options with this, as long as you make sure that you include some of the structures we talked about. It has to have leaves, for instance. That's a mandatory thing, well, for the most part. Stem, roots, those are definitely necessary for a plant. So, some questions. So how does it reproduce? Where would you find it growing? So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes to really draw out your plants, and I'm going to walk around and see what you guys are working on. And walk out of frame. We went with the bulbous method, nice. What else we got going here? We got some pretty petals over there. Small roots on that guy. It's like a gigantic dandelion. So remember, we want to make sure that we make a note of what sort of environment our plant lives in. That's kind of important. Is it an arid, dry location? Does it have to store water, for instance? See, can it withstand long periods of drought? Can it survive in flooded areas? Can look at plants that basically live in water as well if you want to as well. Something we'll touch base on tomorrow as well. You guys another 30 seconds to finish that up. Alright, let's just have somebody share some information about their plant. So if anyone wants to just go for it, go for it. Want to show off your design?
I have a deadly sunflower.
Ooh, and what makes it
So
deadly?
I combined rose thorns, Venus flytrap
Okay.
teeth with the beautiful appearance of a sunflower.
Nice.
Thank you.
Beautiful
Thank you.
and deadly.
Yes.
And what sort of environment would your plant live in?
I'm thinking a desert. I haven't quite decided. Maybe tropical. Yeah.
And would it eat small rodents that pass by any chance? Or have
Yeah.
some sort of mechanism
We'll
for
go for
tracking?
coyotes if it's in the
Coyotes?
desert. Yeah.
Gotcha. All right. And on that note, it's the end of the slide. But so just for a quick transition of what will be happening for the rest of the lecture. So I have a nice little worksheet that should have been handed in at the beginning. I should have mentioned that. But this is the worksheet here developed on all the topics from the class previous, and then this one here. So they'll have a bit of review just by doing this before this class, which is great because there is a quiz that will be done later on in this. So basic fill-in-the-blank questions, extended response items, and from there. So before jumping into that though, I would have just a brief discussion at the end of this plant creating activity on actually some recent research with plants that are non-photosynthetic, and just kind of brainstorm with students how they believe this plant survives, and kind of get some answers out of them or some questioning. So I would do the discussion of that article and then the quiz, and that'd be the remainder of this lesson. And they'd have to hand in the quiz at the end, and as I just said, the vocabulary stuff at the beginning of the lesson. All right, and that will be everything.
Awesome. My YouTube video is at 64%.